Okay, guys, we are back to reviewing 1450 to 1750, and we are talking about these particular vocab terms that you see on the screen. So hopefully most of you listened to my advice yesterday and you went and looked these up. So please double check through chapter 24 in your book to make sure that you can successfully identify each and every one of these to be able to do well on the exam, because they come up quite a bit. So knowing also the order of appearance will be important. For instance, encomiendas come before repartimiento, possibly remembering that the repartimiento system is actually the mita system revamped. It's just what the Spanish will call it. Indentured servitude. Please make sure that you do not tell me that indentured servitude is starting in the Latin American colonies, in New Spain, and in Brazil and Portuguese areas. Indentured servitude is definitely a North American labor system, and knowing what it is in terms of the contracts and what those involve. Plantation systems, I'm pretty confident you're good with. Please double check chapter 24 or reread it, revisit it, whatever. A good thing to do with this would be to make a similarities and differences Venn chart about how the labor systems are compared between North American colonies and Latin American colonies. Also, lastly, the Muslim slave trade, also known as the trans-Saharan slave trade, compared to the Atlantic slave trade, otherwise called chattel slavery. Yesterday, it seemed like some people had some difficulties remembering what the trans-Saharan slave trade was. So think about things like, where are the slaves going? What will they be used for? Are they domestic slaves? Are they being used for hard labor? Can families go? Are men and women being traded? And knowing the similarities and differences between the Atlantic slave trade and the Muslim slave trade. So, for instance, as I mentioned, domestic slaves are mostly trans-Saharan slaves being used in the households, whereas in the transatlantic slave trade and the slavery going to the Americas, we know they're mostly being used on plantations for heavy-duty labor, so mostly men went. So I feel like you would do better with the transatlantic slave trade. Y'all know more about that from middle school and 8th grade. So touch up on your trans-Saharan slave trade information. Okay, so we're back to demographic and environmental changes. This is going back to what we were talking about, the Columbian Exchange, old to new world and vice versa. Knowing once again what came from the old world, which is the Eastern Hemisphere, versus what's going to the new Western Hemisphere. The diseases, which ones came from where. It's probably no big secret that most of the STDs, syphilis is always remembered as coming from New World to Old World. And then, of course, most of the other major diseases wipe out the native populations in North America and South America. Animals, the introduction of those animals, livestock, etc., pros and cons. Clearly there's a lot of pros to having new animals and crops being introduced to both worlds, but there's also cons. For instance, the role that horses had in the extinction of the buffalo, or deforestation in terms of, not deforestation, but overgrazing of land, and crop practices that can destroy the effects of growing one cash crop in one place too long. What are the new crops? What are the new techniques? Thinking in terms of what went where and who profited from it. Comparative population trends, demographic shifts. This is also going to be big in the next time period when we get to the Industrial Revolution. Understanding and analyzing this. The key here is analyzing. So not just knowing that Native American populations went down or Asian populations are going up, Africans both, but telling me why and analyzing why Native American demographics went down, why Europeans went up, and why, the migrations, or the impact that the migrations had in all of this. Explaining what's going on with Africa. Why is the demographics going up and down? What's that about? So making sure that you can explain these demographic trends and the impact that it has on each of those places. Cultural and intellectual developments, okay? So in this particular one, it says CCOT chart, but it really means spice, okay? Because we don't do COT charts anymore. We do spice now. So looking at your cultural developments that are happening here. So the scientific revolution, enlightenment. We did this together. We did a hot seat on this. Chapter 23 has all this. Do we recall the scientists that we learned about? Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, the discoveries that they had, not just their names, but like what did they do that was, profound. geocentric theory going to heliocentric, gravity, the inertia. Enlightenment. Do you remember the Enlightenment thinkers and what it was they were talking about? John Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, Mary Wollstonecraft. Don't forget there are women. There's that hot seat packet we had on this that would be good to look through and looking at the major beliefs of the Enlightenment. Are they supporting absolutism? Are they supporting constitutionalism? What's going on there? The Reformation is also part of this. Protestant Reformation. So reviewing what was happening, why were people, what are the causes of the Reformation, what are the effects of the Reformation. What role does Erasmus in Praise of Folly was a document that we read. Martin Luther and how he really got the ball rolling for the Reformation and the impact of his reforms and how he transformed Christianity to producing the first Protestant faith, Lutheranism. Other reformers, whether you're talking about John Calvin or Henry VIII, in those regards, what are those people doing? The Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits, the Council of Trent, what do the Catholics do to try to combat some of these other reformers? Does it work? What are the big impacts? The 30 Years' War, those kind of things, everything. Witch hunts, that was another big thing to come out of that. So reviewing all of the different details that contribute to and how they impact that. Other things that are outside of your, the causes and impacts. Once again, cause and effect is big here of cultural change. So like syncretism, automatically you should be thinking about the Mughal dynasty. The Mughal dynasty was probably arguably the most syncretic of all of the different empires studied in this particular time period, because the Mughals were huge in taking influences from everywhere, and you see that in their architecture, in their literature, in their governing even. They were not afraid to borrow from other people, and you can see that most well displayed in their architecture, art, and literature. And of course, Akbar, the huge person of bringing all the religious faiths together with the divine faith, his own religion. New races, we've already talked about that. The idea of having mestizos, mulattoes, zombos, what that does with Costa's paintings and the evolution of those types of styles of art and the emphasis of that. The Métis in the French societies. Western dominance and the end of absolutism. Towards the end of this period, we start to see more and more wanting a constitutionalist government, and absolutism is having a hard time to put up with that. So knowing how those cultural exchanges, such as just reading about Enlightenment and reading those documents, will cause a shift in the politics at the end of this time period. Moving to East Asia, changes in continuity in Confucianism. This is kind of a continuity from Song dynasty after the Mongols, and the Ming re-emphasized Neo-Confucianism, and basically how does that impact Ming and Qing, especially Qing China, because if you recall, Qing China is the last dynasty, but it's also invaders. They're not pure Chinese. The Manchu dynasty is the other name for that. So how do they incorporate Neo-Confucianism into their political practices? This idea of self-sufficiency, the isolationism, closing off China from the rest of the world because we don't need anybody, the center of the earth mentality. Once again, merchants, they're the low life. If you're a merchant, then you're not, living off your hard work. The merit system, this idea, civil service exams really get pumped up and amped up in this time. Extended to peasant villages. Whole villages will pay tuitions of any potential candidates to be able to be part of a Confucian school to possibly get a certificate to be a scholar, gentry, or bureaucrat with a certificate. So self-discipline, this is where you probably remember hearing all those crazy stories of students taking Confucian exams and dying because they studied too hard and like weeks in a little room with no food and no breaks. Very, very disciplined, and filial piety is at its height. Very strict male patriarchy. Foot binding becomes not just like a fad, but an oppression mechanism for even lower class, where women are really in a lower position and not given a lot of opportunities. So the emphasis on traditional Chinese practices is high during this time. Major developments and exchanges in arts. Lots going on here. The Renaissance. Not sure how much time you spent on that last year. It's mentioned mostly, I believe, in chapter 21, but knowing about the Renaissance and knowing that, artistically there's an Italian and Northern Renaissance. What are the similarities and differences? Which ones are more oil paint based? Which ones are pastels, watercolors? What are some famous artists you remember? Leonardo, Michelangelo, Dreyer. Not just Italian artists, but also remembering the Renaissance is not just about painting, it's also about literature and pieces of literary work that come out during this time as well. What are they writing about? Humanism, the focus on the individual. Religion is still a focus, but not necessarily everywhere. In the Northern Renaissance, there is more of a focus on Christian humanism and the everyday people, and we see a move away from some of the religious themes. That's definitely going to transfer into themes of the Reformation and how that influences art. Perspective, you can see in the picture, the vanishing point, all the new techniques affiliated with Renaissance. In China, the exchanges of art, like we were saying already, the Manchu adapting Chinese styles of arts, whether it's landscape painting, calligraphy, and the impact of that on things as well. But in China during this time, the other thing to remember about the exchanges and developments is the novel. Popular novels become very, very significant in this time. The Dream of the Red Chamber, Journey to the West, even in Japan, if you recall, when we were filling out our spec charts before we wrote this essay, the travel diaries, the floating worlds, kabuki theater in Japan, not just China. I know Japan's not on here, but there's definitely artistic developments going on in all these areas. Mughal, I already said, highly syncretic, miniature paintings. You can see the influence of Persians, Hindus, and Europeans in there. The architecture as well, having the fact that they hired people from everywhere to come in to build their buildings, plus show them. And there, remember, Akbar had a school of art. Ottoman contributions, of course, mainly in architecture. Sinan, the great architect of Suleiman the Great, Magnificent, having built the Suleymaniye Mosque, the renovations done to the Hagia Sophia when they turned it into a mosque, the Blue Mosque, even the Dome of Jerusalem, and basically anywhere the Ottomans went, we see major architectural developments. All right, Big Red, required to know. You are absolutely required to know these examples. Specific. So you have to know what the maritime empires are. Notice this is the second time that this has come up. This term, maritime empires, not to be confused with imperialism again. These are those trade ports that come up during this time. Remembering the Portuguese and Spanish are the first south of the gate, followed by the Dutch, French, and British, and knowing that the British East India Company and the VOC or Dutch East India Company will dominate, and where they dominate, and the story, not just, how did they get control in India? How do they get control in Southeast Asia? Who do they have to defeat to establish their presence, and how do they keep their presence there? What are the mechanisms they're using to establish their presence? So knowing that term is exclusive to this particular time period, 1450 to 1750, is a big deal. Land empires, once again, these are the ones that we did and you wrote your essay on. Knowing the Manchu is the same thing as the Qing, Mughals, Ottoman, Russians, Safavid. The land empires are big. The one that we're missing here is Tokugawa. It's left off. I'll have to add that. But definitely the Tokugawa is part of these land empires as well. And not forgetting about Russia. Remember, that's a big one that's coming to the game, and they forget about it. But the Asian empires are the ones that we study most, and you're required to know those for sure. And of course, this mega screen of examples that you should know. If I were here, I would be asking you to highlight the things that you don't know right now, and I would be giving you 1 or 2 minutes to do so. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Awkward silence. Okay, enough awkward silence. So I'm going to go through a few that I'm guessing that you would have questions about if I was in front of you. So my guess is the first thing that would come to question is manioc. Poor little manioc, a shrub native to South America, was very important, often called yucca, sometimes a major source of carbohydrates. And so cassava plant was used during the time. It had major impact on African societies during the Columbian Exchange. And so it becomes one of the staple diets in Africa during the Columbian Exchange. But once again, it's from the Americas, comes over. Going down the list, okra, that's part of the African diaspora. Whenever you get to the regions, today we see them as Creole foods, introducing okra and tomatoes together to make some really delicious dishes that we still see famously known in parts of New Orleans and in the Gulf Coast. Big time there. Syncretic religions, that's another thing that's important to remember in terms of the African diaspora as the forced migrations of the African slaves. Basically what starts to happen, not just with the Africans, but the Native Americans as well, is we start to see blends of religions as a result of African belief systems that come with them and also indigenous beliefs of the Americas. So voodoo, for instance, is a combination of African native beliefs mixed with that Roman Catholic influence or Christian influence. Santeria, that's in this, Latin American communities as well. Another syncretic blend of Native American beliefs mixed with religion and Christianity. And so you get these offshoots or syncretic religions. Sikhism, going back to India, definitely syncretic religion, an attempt to bring Hinduism and Islam together, which basically ends up causing more of a divide. And of course, I could have put Akbar's divine faith in there as well, but knowing the examples of these and knowing what they are. Moving down the list, I think you know most of these. I won't go into that. But knowing that there's entrepreneurs, what is an entrepreneur? A person that's a risk taker going to start businesses in all major parts of the cities in the world, trying to make those businesses and becoming part of that growing merchant class. We've already gone over the different mestizos, mulatto, creoles, peninsulares. I'm not going to talk about that. Don't forget about woodblock prints in Japan. That's one of the major artistics. The tsunami wave is probably the most famous visual of the Japanese art at the time that you probably remember seeing. Codices are the records that Mesoamerican, we talked about them being on round discs, but also just on any type of stone, the images that you find that later the Spanish will try to translate. Cervantes, Miguel Cervantes, Don Quixote de la Mancha. Not to forget that Spain had a golden age during this time that produced cultures. Hopefully those of you taking Spanish will know about Miguel Cervantes, but also some of the artists during this time that were famous as well, and some of the Renaissance art to come out of Spain. Sundiata, we talked a little bit about that when we were looking at Sunni Ali. Go back to the African kingdoms again. So Sundiata, looking at those African kingdoms, and he is definitely the Lion King that I was talking about. I think I was saying Sunni Ali the other day, but he was Mandinka, the Mali Empire. So forget what I told you yesterday. Sunni Ali is the Songhai Empire. He was not the Lion King. I was wrong. It's actually Sundiata, and Sundiata is the king of the Mali people, and so he's the founder of Mali, who was also known as Sanajara or the Lion King. And so this is the guy that will go before Mansa Musa. So sorry for the confusion yesterday. Sundiata, Lion King, also in chapter 25. Kabuki Theater, Journey to the West. I just talked about that previously in terms of cultural contributions from China and Japan. Don't forget about those floating worlds in Japan. They're going to be major in terms of what you, specific types of cultural examples that you have. The development of the frontier settlements. Russia. Don't forget about Siberia. I believe it's in chapter 24 where it talks about the expansion, and it'll talk about the Bering and the travelers and the explorers and the Dutch that are actually in Siberia, and how Siberia is going to become a major labor force for the expanding Russian Empire. This is where Siberia is going to get, kind of cast off as a place where you send people to do hard labor. And reviewing that in your chapter when it has the section about Russia and reviewing not just about Russian expansion, but the Siberian people and how they fought off some of that for a while. Zaminders, that would be a term that I would guess that most of you have not recalled. And so remembering, if you forgot, that a Zaminder is in the Indian subcontinent and an aristocrat, basically landowner. So in the Persian Empire as well, Zamindars are referred to as landowners as well. They held huge tracts of land and controlled peasants during this time. So looking at that title or not being confused by it because we didn't talk too much about it. During the Mughal Empire, Zamindars belonged to the nobility, and Akbar granted them mansabs and ancestral domains, and mansabs were territories. Okay, so keep in mind that is a Mughal word that you should be affiliated with. Okay, other examples of things you should know for sure. European notions of divine right. We talked about that in regard to Louis XIV and his divine right theory that God has given him the divine right to rule as God's right-hand man. And basically he is acting as God on earth. Safavid use of Shi'ism, the 12 Shi'ism story and everything surrounding that when you go back to learn about the founders of the Safavid Empire and learning about that and the Safavid rulers and how they used it to enforce their theocracy. Human sacrifice we talked about yesterday. Aztec practices it more, the Mexica and why they do it and how it's affiliated in their society and why they believe in it. Songhai Empire we talked about already, promotion of Islam and spreading of Islam within West African kingdoms. Let's see, we know about Confucian rituals and public performance of that so that the people are to enforce public appeal to Confucianism on holidays. And making sure they know. So for instance, this disdain for merchants and praising of farmers. It was a thing where the Chinese emperor would actually go and farm one day of the year to show his reverence for farmers and that types of public ritual or performance. Ottoman treatment of non-Muslims. We talked about that, millet systems and the jizya and talking about what millet systems were allowed to do. So if you refer to that and looking at how the Ottoman used those different systems within it and those little communities of non-Muslims and how they interacted with the Islamic world. Let's see here. Devshirme, that's whenever they quote, kidnap or enlist little boys from the Caucasus regions and Balkans to be part of the training to keep loyalty to the Ottomans. Remember, they trained them, they converted it into Islam. The smart ones would become bureaucrats, and then the strong ones would be janissary. So reviewing that, we watched the video on this. Remember, we had some videos here. Salaried samurai. Remember, it's during the Tokugawa that the samurai lose their rice stipends and basically they have to start working and making money for themselves. And so some samurai are able to, make a living for themselves, but a lot of them become very poor during this time. Some become bureaucrats. Some actually start teaching martial arts, but others are forced into farming and they become poor because even though they're revered in status, the changes of the Tokugawa dynasty, they're not necessarily going to be fighting. And so a lot of samurai aren't sure how to use their time. Piracy, a topic that I love that we don't really talk about because it's more in the age of exploration, which you did not have me for, but lots of piracy in the Caribbean. This is the golden age of piracy. This is why, the movies are made, Pirates of the Caribbean. This is a real thing that's happening. So looking into the accounts of pirates and, who were the pirates? You'll find out that a lot of these were actually privateers working for, England and Spain and basically going in to have free reign on attacking ships and trying to steal and plunder goods. And then, of course, those that went into their own private businesses, buccaneers and things like that will become the ones that are most notorious, like Blackbeard, etc. So recognizing that the pirates are hunting and waiting for treasure ships, specifically galleons that are full of sugar, gold, rum. And keep in mind, it's not just about the gold and the silver. They're also trying to get those valuable goods like sugar and, cotton, tobacco, slaves even. So they're dealing in that. They're like the black market during this time and making money off of that. The 30 Years' War, do we remember what that is and how it's connected to religion and the Protestant and Counter-Reformation and what it does? Keep in mind that this is the bloodiest battle, not battle because there's more than one, but it's the bloodiest war until World War I. Lots of devastating effects in Europe, a lot of bloodshed over religion. And then, of course, the Ottoman-Safavid conflict and what's going on there between these two rivals. The Ottoman basically taking on the name are fighting for Sunni Islam, and then, of course, the Safavid in terms of Shiite. But the video we watched on the Ottomans should help you review that kind of stuff as well. Okay, so the good news is that is the end of the the 1450 to 1750. We're about to begin our topic on 1750 to 1900. So give me a minute to change out.